Hi, I'm Ian Sharman. I'm the head coach at Sharman Ultra Coaching. Today we're going to do a Facebook Live Q&A, so I've got some questions in advance. I've also got more that I'll answer from the live questions during the show. We've had a few of these already from some of the other coaches, and we'll have more to come as well. Plus, you can see previous videos either on our Facebook page or on our website. But I'll get right into it, telling you a little bit more, first of all, about who I am. So I've been ultra running for about 17, 18 years now. I got into it when I was in my early 20s. And I've done, I think, 250-ish marathons and ultras. Particularly things like Western States and Leadville have been big ones for me, and doing the Grand Slam of ultra running that included both of those in the same year. So I've been well into my hundreds for a long time. Right at the moment, it's a little bit more about marathons and a bit of road running, but it's always fun to keep it varied. So I'll delve right into the questions, and feel free to ask them as the show gets going. Okay. So first question is, lotteries aren't over yet, but what's the best way to choose a main race for next year if I'm not lucky in any of them? Good question, and something that people at this time of year are likely to have many issues with. We just had Western States and Hard Rock lotteries, UTMB, Leadville, and many others are around this time of year as well. They're in January. So a lot of people are not going to get into their first choice. So it's a case of seeing what they can do instead. So I think the main things to decide are, first of all, what do you want to do? So it's got to be something that you're going to care about enough. If you were wanting to do, say, UTMB, then maybe it's something similar to that. I wouldn't just do something to get stones for UTMB or just to get in the lottery, for example, for Western States. That's certainly a consideration, but if that's the only consideration, I don't think that's going to be the best way to choose a race, because you're more likely to then find that as you get deep into it and it gets difficult, you just don't have a good enough reason why. And sometimes the reason of just wanting to get into the other race or wanting to have a chance to get into the other race is enough. But I'd say that's better to have as one of the options. So if you're choosing between various ones and you're thinking, well, this one I kind of like, this one I really like, but it's a bit more expensive or it's a bit harder to fit in, I would always try and bias towards the one that's going to be a bit more exciting, that you're really going to want to do. Because anything above about 100K, if you don't have a good reason why, it's difficult to do it just for the sake of it or just for training. Next question. What are your top tips for Leadville? There's certainly a lot of things that'll matter a lot for Leadville Trail 100. I mean, that's at a high altitude. Almost the whole race is above 10,000 feet. That's about 3,000 meters of altitude up high in Colorado. So I'll just focus on things that are maybe specific for Leadville as opposed to other 100 miles as well. So first of all, the altitude is probably the single biggest thing that is unique to that type of race. Things like Hard Rock are very similar with this same advice as well. But one of the things that will cause people to not finish is the fact that they're not adapted enough to altitude. And up to about maybe 8,000 feet or so, you typically won't tend to get altitude sickness. Above 8,000 feet, that can start to come in. So when the whole thing is above 10,000 and you're above that for a long period, that does tend to be the kind of thing that can really hold people back, can cause them to feel nauseous, can get headaches. And really then once that starts happening, the only thing that can improve it is going down lower, but it can take a long time to get back to feeling good. And within the context of the race, that might not allow enough time to finish it. So number one tip I'd always say is have time at higher altitude in advance. Even if you live somewhere relatively high, like 5,000 or 6,000 feet, somewhere like Denver, Boulder, I would recommend having at least 7 days in advance of the race up nearer the kind of Leadville altitude, so 8,000 plus feet for a minimum of 7 days. And the reason for that is that after about 1 or 2 days, you're just starting to feel the effects of being at altitude, but your body hasn't adapted to it really at all. After a few more days, that starts to change, and it's by about a week where you start to be a net positive there, and you'll be better off. So I would recommend having at least enough time up there, a week minimum, if you're going to do a Leadville or Hard Rock type race. If that's not feasible, which it is for most people, your next best option would be arriving right before, like the night before, so you have less of that first couple of days making you feel bad. But your chances of finishing are going to be significantly lower, even if you're very fit. But the things that you can do if you can't get up there in advance are, the fitter you are, the easier it'll be on your body. And that allows you to have a lower intensity, because higher intensity is more difficult at altitude in terms of causing things like altitude sickness. But also, often the people who get the most altitude sickness when they go to places like the Himalayas are young, fit males because they think they can do loads. So it doesn't actually give you an improvement in terms of how well you adapt to be fitter. It just gives you a bit more leeway for you can have a lower effort, not be pushing as hard, not be breathing as hard, not requiring as much oxygen for the exercise you're doing. So as long as you keep it easier, a higher level of fitness will be useful. Other things you can do, heat training. It has a lot of the similar type of adaptations, particularly it creates more blood plasma, which is very helpful and similar to the kind of things that happen when you're at altitude. And that can lead then to creating more red blood cells to some degree. Not quite the same stimulus as being at high altitude, but it still has an overlap. So if you live somewhere hot, doing heat training through the summertime in advance of a race like that can be helpful. Or sauna work in advance if you don't live somewhere quite as hot. And equally, just making sure that you turn up not too tired, because that's one of the other risks people have is either they go up to altitude in advance and train too hard, or they do too much heat training, or just too much at the last minute and then go up to altitude, and that's extra exhausting. So I would say make sure that whatever fitness you have and whatever you feel like about a week out, you can't push things too much there, but just being at altitude is useful, and the heat training in about the month in advance can certainly be useful. And we'll talk a bit more about heat training again as well, because there's other questions that I have related to Western states that are going to be talking about that. So yeah, main things you can do are go to altitude for a minimum of 7 days. Be as fit as you can. That helps obviously for every race that you do, and heat training can be useful as well. Next question. How has Western States 100 changed since you first raced there? So I raced there every year from 2010 to 2019. I had some very good races there, some okay races, and 9 of them were in the top 10. So that is one of my favorite races. I've also gone back to it twice to pace and crew for friends. Absolutely fantastic race in every possible way. It has obviously got bigger since 2010. One of the main things there is that you see a lot more crew members, and also you see a lot more videoing and brands both on the shirts for people and also just there in person trying to get footage and trying to get as much benefit as they can out of it. There's also clearly more sponsors of the race, and things like Hoka now being the sponsor. They make probably a bigger deal of it than previous sponsors did. And the other thing is it has got more competitive. It's become more international, even in that period. 2010 was kind of the year where it got on more of the international scene. Up until then, it was mainly, I think maybe exclusively, Americans who'd won it, and pretty much all Californians. And that was the year that Killian came. There's also Jeff Rose and Anton Krupicka, and those three had an epic battle. Really fantastic. If you haven't seen the movie Unbreakable by... escapes my memory now, but anyway, Unbreakable, the movie about the 2010 Western States top men, absolutely fantastic video, really gives a sense of what the entire race is like, and it captured a year where the course record was broken. Things have got more competitive with more international races, and ultra running in general has got more competitive, of course, as well. So that's part of it, but I wouldn't say necessarily that the top 10 runners are that much different to what they would have been in the past. Just a couple of years ago, 10th place male was, I think, 18 and a half hours. That was slower than any of the years in the decade that I ran. So there is more competition, but also there's more pressure. And I think that means that sometimes people roll the dice, take a little bit too much risk, and particularly on a hotter day, that's more likely to cause problems there. So it makes it more interesting to watch. And actually, that's probably the other thing that's changed the most. It's now way easier to see what's going on if you're not there, because they have amazing live coverage, video, commentary, video, in fact, at different places on the course, and not just the aid stations, and at the finish line as well. So that's something that's only been happening the last few years. Before that, it was all Twitter-based updates, and that still occurs with iRunFar and others. But probably the biggest thing for someone who's not there is that you can see more of it now, and that there's going to be a lot more videos that come out of it from individuals who are racing there too. Next question. You've run a lot of downhill marathons in recent years. Why? Good question. I like my marathons. I've done, I think, 130 or so road marathons. And when I first got into running, I was doing about 25 marathons or ultras a year. So from my first marathon to my 100th, which was an ultra, was 4 years, or just over 4 years. And so that was very condensed. I was living in London, just traveling away. Like Saturday morning, I'd get on a cheap, low-cost airline flight straight to an expo in a European city, go to a hostel, sleep in a room full of other people, none of them runners, and then get up, do the marathon, quick shower, back on a flight, back in the office on Monday morning, went back when I had an office job. So I like my marathons. It's a good summary of that. The downhill ones, these are in particular part of this series called Revel. They have them typically outside big cities where there are mountains, and so they have a big downhill. Things like outside Vegas, they have the Mount Charleston one that comes down about 5,200 feet. The one I just did a couple of weeks ago is Big Bear on the edge of LA. And that again comes down just over 5,000 feet in a marathon. So you can imagine there's a lot of downhill in there, very little uphill. I think the total uphill in both those races is maybe a couple of hundred feet, so less than you get in a typical flat marathon, but with that downhill allowing for extra speed. I like it just because it's a good way to go quick. It's a new challenge. The fact that you get the varying hills and varying degrees of downhill gradient makes it more like running an ultra. So it has that additional factor on top of just running a flat marathon as well as being quicker. And just seeing how well you can judge all of that, I think is a very enjoyable challenge for me. I like the fact that I don't know exactly how to do in advance. I've got a pretty good idea, and particularly if I go back to the same race again, like I've done the Mount Charleston one 3 times, and that was my 3 fastest marathons at that point, all of them going very well. And then this latest one was just a tiny bit quicker at the Big Bear course. But they are just a fantastic way to get a Boston qualifier as well. That's one of the main reasons people do them, to get practice for how to run a race. So any marathon, any race, to be honest, is going to help you in terms of tactics and pacing and just seeing how well you can do things. But the downhill ones just have that additional variable because you're not just thinking about how hard you're pushing. And also bear in mind, if it's coming down 5,000 feet, that means it's starting at some degree of altitude. So Mount Charleston starts at 7,500 feet, comes down to about 2,500 feet. Big Bear comes down from 6,700 to about 1,500. So when you've got that amount of change in altitude, you're also thinking about the same kind of things you'll do in an ultra, which is how are all the variables affecting me personally? How tired am I? How hard is it to breathe? How hot is it? And so it just adds that extra bit of variability. But particularly for me, I think it's a really good way to just keep marathons interesting. I'm also aiming to try and go for a marathon PR in the next year. I was about a minute away from doing that last year, and that PR is from 2009. So it's a while since I've done that on a flat course. The downhill ones are clearly quicker, and so that's a kind of separate PR for me. But I'm going to aim again next year to do that as well. So I think they're a very good, fun way to just do something a little bit different, and particularly for an ultra runner, to maybe think of road running as something a bit more exciting than it otherwise would be. Let's see if any other questions have been coming in. I've got a couple more that came in advance. Here's another one. Matthew Brainer, he says, I asked Sean and Annie about this as well. They just recently had Q&As, as I mentioned. But I'm very curious about your personal and coach pacing strategies for ultras, especially those with variable terrain, assuming the course allows it. Do you like the concept of even or possibly negative splitting races? Maybe you could use Leadville as an example, and how would you approach the splits? Yeah, I would say up to the marathon, a well-trained runner, that doesn't necessarily mean a front runner, but someone who has trained well for it and put the work in, even if they're running 4.5 hours, should be able to do something like an even split or better. And when you see world records being set, they are typically a slight negative split because they're going the same pace, then they break away from the pack, go a little bit quicker at one point, and that means that they're a little faster in the second half than the first half. So typically, I would say for someone trying to get their best marathon, it will be beneficial to be an even split or a slight negative split. Depends on the course. If there are variations in there, like there's hills in the second half, not the first half, that's different. So Boston being an example, there's a bit more downhill and flatter running in the first half of Boston. The famous hills, particularly Heartbreak Hill, is in the second half. So Boston, an ideal race where you've gone to the absolute limit of what you can do, would probably be a slight positive split because of course factors as opposed to good pacing factors. In ultras, I think that's a bit different. Once you get to a certain distance and a certain number of hours on feet, the amount of muscle damage you're going to have is going to factor in. So anyone finishing a 100-miler, when you're at mile 99, your legs do not have the same physical capability as when you're at mile 1. There's just more muscle damage, more fatigue. You've used up energy sources in the body. A lot of things have just got a lot more challenging there. So in that case, I'd say it's more about minimizing how much you slow down. And the phrase I always like to use is that it's not how fast you do your fastest mile, it's how fast you do your slowest mile. So if I use Leadville as an example, that is out and back. So it's pretty much the same in each direction. You've got 3 big climbs on the way out, and and the halfway point is about the same altitude as the starting point, just over 10,000 feet. Each of those 3 climbs on the way back is a bit steeper and shorter. And so when you're tired, that can be extra difficult. But I would argue that a well-run race at Leadville or any 100-miler would have minimal slowdown. So to put some numbers on that, when the course record was set by Matt Carpenter back in 2004, 2005, he did, I think, 7:38 for the first half and then 8:04. I think 15:42 is the finish time. So he's only slowing down less than half an hour. Very small amount of slowdown there. And that's why it's such an amazingly fast time. There's a lot of guys who go out and are fairly close to his split for the first half, and then they're 2 hours plus slower on the second half. And when that happens, they probably haven't optimally paced. They probably could have run a better race by going maybe half an hour slower in the first half. And you'll also see a lot of people with, say, the 25-hour buckle or the 30-hour finish cutoff who are going to have a very big positive split. So maybe a 25-hour finisher who does 10 hours, then 14 and a half hours. That's a very common thing. And that's a big slowdown. And I would argue if they paced it better, they could probably have run a faster time. My best ones, I think, were about a 7:50, then an 8:30 split. And that was where I was typically, well, I was never in first place at halftime, even with 4 wins, but at halfway. But then even with a couple of people around me, they'd be about 2 hours back typically at the end. So if I'm doing 8.5 hours for the second half, they're doing 10.5 hours. And that's still for someone having a very good race, running a very fast time. But I would argue they went too fast in the first half. And that ability to minimize the slowdown in the second half, it's partly self-fulfilling and it's partly something you're aiming to do. But the mentality you want to avoid is, well, I'm going to slow down, so I've got to bank some time. This is what people do in every type of race, be it 5Ks through to 200 milers. But if you're going above what is sustainable for the whole race, then by definition, you're going to pay for that later. And if you go a little bit too fast, then what happens in the second half is that you lose more time than you gained. So Bruce Fordyce, a very famous ultra runner, he won Comrades in South Africa 9 times in the 80s. He was the former 50-mile world record holder. The way he put it is in a marathon, if you go a minute too quick, and by that he means above what is your theoretical perfect race, a minute too quick to halfway, you lose 2 minutes in the second half. In a 50-miler, maybe it's 1 minute too quick to halfway and it's 4 minutes, or maybe even more than that in the second half. And so that's a very small amount if you're thinking about within 50 miles, if you could know exactly what your best pacing was and you were to do that, to be just a little bit ahead of that, and that just might be pushing a bit too much on one hill, for example, you're going to lose more time than you gained in the second half. And for a 100-miler or a 200-miler, I would say that penalty in percentage terms is even bigger, because once you start slowing down, you could be sat in an aid station for 3 hours, you could be death marching at a 50-minute mile pace instead of jogging at a 12-minute mile pace. So there's even more potential to lose more time than you gain. So particularly in 100-milers, don't think about trying to gain time early on. You're just trying to keep it as easy as possible, as long as possible. That gets you deeper into the race before it gets hard. And then when it gets hard, you're going to slow down to some degree. And there's going to be bad patches. But the ability to get through those and to be able to move well at that point, like I said, the slowest mile of the day is what matters. And that slowest mile, if that's a 25-minute mile on an uphill that you're hiking versus 1 hour because you spend half of that sitting in an aid station, the other half walking slowly on the flat, that's where you're going to lose the time. So just thinking about it in terms of how the numbers add up, as well as just trying to save yourself for later. But the difficulty there is it's really difficult to know what is an appropriate pace, because a 100-mile pace is very easy and slow. And particularly if you haven't done them before, what would be sustainable for 10 hours versus 20 hours versus 30 hours? It's going to be fine margins. So the thing that I think can practically help with that is tell yourself that if the effort level goes up a little bit, you're going to try and take it down. And in particular, if you think you're going too fast, you are. If you're on a longer ultra and it even crosses your mind, maybe I'm pushing a bit on this hill and I shouldn't be, or maybe I'm breathing a bit too hard, or I haven't had a power hiking section for a few hours, then just take it a bit easier, because there's virtually no penalty for slowing down marginally. Because while you feel good, you'll still move at a decent pace. It's when you feel bad that your pace is going to really drop off. So you're just trying to avoid feeling bad, or push it as deep into the race, or ideally also, these things will happen, they're difficult races, to identify it as early as possible, do something about it, often slowing down, maybe taking on some calories before you're forced to. And to put that in the context of a marathon, there'll be a lot of people who maybe are thinking, well, I've got to do this exact time, so that means X minutes per mile, and they just keep doing that until they can't. And maybe they get 18 to 20 miles in, and then it gets difficult, they hit a wall. And instead of adjusting a little bit, maybe right before that, taking on a gel, slowing down, say 10 seconds a mile, and having hardly any effect on their overall pace, they keep hitting the splits because they want to hit that finish time. They're too focused on the outcome and not the process of how to do a good race. And then they lose more time than they gain. So hopefully that answers things and makes it a little bit easier to understand what you can do practically, as well as what the theory is of how to run a better race and to pace it better. Another question that's come through here. If partway through a higher altitude race you start feeling bad, what tactics can get you through? This would be in some ways similar to any other ultra, to be honest, which is slow it down, lower the intensity, and try and take on some calories. If your stomach is bad and you're feeling particularly headaches, that type of thing, the altitude element of it, as I mentioned before, is you want to come down in altitude. And the advice they give to people in high mountains, so even higher than the Rockies, is if you can come down about 200 meters, which is a bit over 600 feet, that will usually start having an effect on how good you feel, and the altitude sickness starts to dissipate. So if you're at the top of, say, Hope Pass, the highest point of Leadville, that's 12,600 feet. If you come down even a little bit, and the next mile you're going to come down the amount we've just described, 600 feet plus, then you're going to start feeling a little bit better. The difficulty is when you're at higher altitudes for longer periods, it kind of accumulates both that fatigue and that nausea and all the difficult things that are happening to your body. That adds up. The more you do something difficult, the more it's wearing you down. So the main things you can do at altitude are try and go lower. If you're at a point where you can't go any lower and you've got headaches, or you're feeling really sick, then at the very least slowing it down. And if it's headaches and it starts to get worse, the best thing to do is to get out of the race and go somewhere lower, because that can be very dangerous. But otherwise, yeah, slow down. If you lower the intensity, your heart rate comes down, your oxygen requirement comes down, and that just makes it that little bit easier on your body. But much better to try and prevent this than cure it. So we mentioned a minute ago about how you can try and prepare for it. If it's happening in the race, you can try to avoid that by making sure you don't pace too aggressively. That's going to lower the chance of feeling bad at altitude, as well as hopefully saving your legs for later as well. But I'd say that the main thing is, when things start going wrong in a race, identify it as quickly as possible. And the main issue people have is that they just stick to plan A. So they were expecting to feel a certain way, they wanted to go at a certain pace, and they keep doing that until they're forced to slow down. So instead, what you want to do is be aware, have things changed? Do you feel a little bit different? And do you need to back off a little bit from there? And try and do that maybe half an hour earlier, rather than waiting till the point when you feel really bad. But with altitude, especially if you haven't had time at altitude in advance, that can just happen anyway. And that's where I was saying that the risk of just having a DNF because the altitude sickness hits you, no matter how well trained you are, if you haven't had the time up there in advance, is just higher. So anyone doing a really high altitude race for a long period, it's worth committing that extra time to it, because you're committing a lot of money, you're committing a lot of time in training to get there. Why not add that extra little bit and say, well, it's not worth doing unless we can commit fully to this. And I'm not saying you have to go up there for a month or something like that, but 1 week minimum at these higher altitudes. These days, it's a little bit more feasible to do things like work remotely. What I personally did was I'd usually go up for about 2 weeks and work just from nearby towns to Leadville, so that it wasn't really time off, but it was still nice to be in the mountains and get used to the altitude. Next question, another one from the ones in advance. What's so special about Comrades? I've noticed that you love this race and you go back to it a lot. So Comrades is just over a double marathon. It's between 54 and 55 and a half miles. Depending on which direction it is, because it alternates direction each year, in South Africa. Road race, very hilly, one of the oldest ultras in the world. I think it started in 1921. The reason it's called Comrades is it was in memory of their fallen comrades from World War I. And it is also the largest ultra in the world. It has about 20,000 people in it, so more like the big city marathon feel, but with runners who are going a lot further than that and with a crowd who are really into it. Probably the most similar experience you get with road running would be something like Boston, where the town loves it. Everyone knows someone who's run a marathon, and that is more than just, oh, it's an inconvenience and the roads are closed like it would be in many cities for most people who aren't runners. In Boston, it feels a bit more special, and Comrades very much has that. And even people who aren't runners tend to have done Comrades. And also, to put it in context, like if you're an ultra runner in the US, people will typically say, oh, okay, are you aiming to get into Western states at some point? That's kind of the pinnacle, or maybe Hard Rock might be in that same conversation now as well. But usually it's like, if you ultra run, this is what you must be training for. If you run in South Africa, even though it's a road-based race, they wouldn't be assuming you're doing a marathon. They'd assume that you're doing marathons to train for Comrades, because that is the big thing. And so I've loved going there. It was one of the first ultras I did back in 2007. I've done it 8 times now. They also have different medals for different finish times, which gives you that extra little bit of reason to try and push. So there's a 12-hour cutoff, so about a 6-hour marathon pace times 2. They also have, I think it's an 11-hour medal. They have a 9-hour medal, a 7.5-hour medal, a 6-hour medal, plus the top 10 men and top 10 women get a different medal as well. So all of that just makes for a lot of reason to push yourself a little bit more. And this year, 2023, I was finally able to break 6 hours and didn't get the top 10. That was the main aim, but I knew that was a stretch. But I did get that sub 6-hour medal. So I've got that somewhere around here. I probably should have thought about that. But anyway, that means a lot to me to be able to go back to that. So much so, my dog is named Comrades. So that's how much I like that race. But yeah, I think it's just the atmosphere. And for a lot of people who maybe done Western ultras, by which I mean Europe and North America, it's just a very different vibe to it. They have some fantastic music just for the start line. They do Chariots of Fire. They do a mining song called Show Salosa, which you get all the guys around you singing it. And also they have, of course, pens for different seating. If you're nearer the front, you're basically surrounded by a load of local guys who know this song. Very different vibe. You know, our sport is very white in general. If you're there, it's mainly black guys around you singing this song, and just the camaraderie and the emotion you get from hearing this epic song being sung around you is, I really can't describe it, but I have to recommend anyone who likes ultras at all, even if you don't think you're a road runner or you don't like road marathons, it is well worth doing Comrades once in your life. It is a long way away, difficult to get to from Europe and particularly from North America, but it's an absolutely fantastic race. So I couldn't recommend it highly enough, and probably my favorite race as well. Next question. What's the best type of speed session for 100 milers? I think the key thing here is there's not one session that is the best thing to do. Whatever you're training for, you want to have a variety of different types of speed work, variety of different types of terrain. You always want to have long runs, speed sessions, hill work, and lots of easy running. That just gets more specific depending on what you're doing. So if you're going to be doing a hillier 100 miler or a more mountainous 100 miler, you still want to do some flat speed work. Tempo runs, I'd say, in particular, are something that's essential for any type of race because they're practicing pacing. They're reasonably intense and lasting for maybe 6 to 10 miles. But they're not racing. They're not as hard as, say, running a 10K or a half marathon. But they are getting that elevated heart rate for a bit longer. I'd still say it's very good to do interval speed sessions, and particularly if you've got a hilly 100 miler, maybe uphill speed work, things like 8 by 3 minutes uphill, and then jogging back down for your recovery. But there is no one best speed session. There's no magic speed session, or this is what the Norwegians are doing, or anything like that. The main principle I'd say is keep them varied. If you do the same thing again and again, your body's going to get used to that stimulus, but not as much to other things. So if you do the 8 by 3 minute uphill all the time and no other speed session, you will get better at it, but also you'll get diminishing returns from doing that same thing again and again. And it's not to say that wouldn't be very good training, but you're going to get probably more benefit by varying things and forcing not only your body to do different things in terms of different intensities and having different gears that you can run at, it's also forcing your mind to think more about pacing. How does it differ if you're doing a 2-minute rep versus a 4-minute rep? How does it differ if it's uphill versus on the flat? So there isn't necessarily one particular thing, but it will be more dialed in for the type of race you're doing. But I would still include track type work for someone doing a 100 miler. It would just be further away from the start time typically. So if you have, say, 6 months, as it kind of is at this point at the end of the year, to summer races, this is a great time to ease into some speed work, maybe have a period of winter where you focus more on speed in general, and that can include shorter distance speed, 5K, 10K, half marathon, marathon type fitness, including short intervals. And then as you get closer to the 100 miler, to do things that are going to be on more similar terrain, speed sessions that are maybe slightly longer reps, even races count as part of that. Like I like to finish off my winter/spring build up to summer races by having a marathon. It's just a very good way to get a payoff where it combines both speed and endurance, and it's a hard effort, and it's race practice as well. Next question. You're known for wearing a lot of layers for heat training runs, but I've read that's not the best way to do it. So can you explain what the point is? Very good. I think this is something where I certainly have been known for that. I posted every year when I was going to Western States. I'd be doing my 8 different layers of clothing, covering my head with a woolly hat kind of thing, wearing gloves, long pants while it is hot. And then just trying to make myself uncomfortably hot. So the first thing I'd say is there's no need to do long runs like that because they're just going to be debilitating. And also bear in mind that where I live in Oregon, typically before Western States, it's not super hot. So it's not like I'm going out in 100 degrees and then wearing lots of layers. It's more just a way to get myself uncomfortably hot while exercising. Scientifically, it is better to do this in general and more sustainable by using a sauna. So the thing I would recommend as the gold standard of doing heat training is for about a month before a race to have access to a sauna, ideally a hot sauna. I think the infrared one's not necessarily quite as good, but very similar. They're not going to get you necessarily quite as hot. Do your exercise, your run, straight into the sauna afterwards. So you've already elevated your heart rate. And then on top of that, potentially maybe about half an hour in there, it might be a bit less at first. You're just trying to get yourself uncomfortably hot by the end, not to the point where you're fainting or you're going to pass out or you feel completely wiped out, although those first couple of times might feel a bit harder until you get used to it. And doing that maybe 3 or 4 times a week. So finish a run, go and sit in the sauna. That's kind of the standard thing to do. And then the final week, maybe 1 session a few days away, but I wouldn't do too much then. But the benefit still of doing it where you wear a lot of layers of clothing is you're preparing yourself mentally for what you'll do in the race. So if you were to do Western States, for example, and you've never actually run in extreme heat, but you've done loads of sauna training, your body can be very well adapted to it, but you're not going to know what it feels like. And in particular, one of the biggest things that you'll notice is that you have lethargy and apathy towards running. So you just won't care as much. You'll just find you're kind of flagging and everything feels a lot harder. So if you've not gone through that, that can be very demotivating on race day. And that will happen no matter how much training you do. You're going to feel that when you're in direct sunlight at the hottest time of the day, and you've had hours and hours of heating up as well. So I think it's very important to make sure you do heat training. But then this is a tip from Rob Krah. He always said that he did heat management, not heat training. So if you've seen photos of him at Western States, he would have ridiculous amounts of ice over him. He'd have a hat that looked like it was about 5 times bigger on his head because it was so full of ice. He'd have it in a massive bandana. He'd have it down arm sleeves. He'd have it with drinks he's carrying as well to be able to pour on his head. And that I think is essential too, especially if it's a really hot year. And there's a big difference between a, say, 100-degree Fahrenheit year at Western States and a 90-degree. 90-degree, you can get away with a bit more. And like this year was even cooler than that. And usually the course record years are significantly cooler. And that's why it's possible to run faster and you don't have to spend as much time getting ice and getting access to things like that. But I think that the main thing is you do want to manage it. So you want to practice that. You also want to know what it feels like being outside running and overheating and feeling crappy, but you don't need to overdo that. Maybe just once or twice I think would be good for that, but I still think there's a lot of value in it. But typically, yeah, I have changed the way that I approach them and would make more use of a sauna. One other complication there is particularly with the pandemic in recent years, saunas weren't necessarily available, or you might not want to go into a small crowded room with some other people and potentially ruin your training because they give you a cold or they give you COVID or something. So that was another reason why doing stuff outside can be helpful there. But you don't want to overdo it. You don't want to do long runs. You don't want to do it too frequently, but being able to elevate your core temperature to the point where it gets uncomfortable. And that's easiest to do by running and then going straight in the sauna. Next question is, what do you prefer, roads or trails? I love both. Right now, I'm liking roads more. I'm probably known more as a 100-mile trail runner, given that all the winds and other things are related to that. And I'm certainly nowhere near a professional road marathoner. My best flat marathon is 2:32, so that's not going to win any prizes there. And even on the downhill ones, I'm just kind of on the verge of 2:20, which I love and it means a lot to me, but it's not going to pay the bills or anything like that. But I do enjoy it more. And I'm now 43. So I feel like I've got a slight year or two left where I can still maybe get road marathon lifetime bests. Just did it on the downhill one. I know I can do it just, I think, on a flat one as well, hopefully break 2:30. So right now, yeah, I like varying between them. I do both through the year. I typically, every year, will have road and trail races. But right now, because I'm feeling one side is a little bit more enjoyable for me, I'm doing more of that. And I think the lesson from that is that you don't just have to do things because that's what you think you should do. Like all your friends run Boston every year, but you've got bored of road marathons. Do more trail stuff or do different types of race. You do a 100-mile qualifier for Western States every year, but you've stopped caring about Western States. Okay, well, maybe that's not the most important thing to you, especially now that the tickets will roll over. You don't just lose them. So maybe that year you don't go into the lottery and you don't get a 100-mile qualifier or a 100K qualifier, and instead you focus on something different. But I think it's really important for longevity in the sport, both from a mental and a physical burnout point of view, to keep it varied. And so I like doing both. And I will come back to trails. I will do 100-mile trail races again, particularly Leadville and Western States, hopefully. But for the next year, it's going to be more about roads, and particularly because Comrades is the one that I'd like to really get towards again. So the next down run at Comrades is 2025. So I'm going to try and get faster in the marathon in 24. That'll prepare me well for then hopefully having my last big roll of the dice at Comrades at almost age 45. Next question, and what are the best ways to avoid slowing towards the end of a 100-miler? We covered that one. That was a question that we had before about just trying to make sure that you pace well, that you've got a good sense of your fitness, that you practice things in previous races, and that you're trying to preempt things as they start to go wrong. And you're not just expecting it to feel a certain way, but instead you're backing off in advance, or if you feel something's a little bit wrong or you need to fix something, even as simple as there's a stone in your shoe, fix that right now. Don't wait till the aid station, because right now it's a very quick thing, and either way you're going to have to fix it. So it's going to take time to take your shoe off, but it's better to do that sooner rather than later before it rubs away, causes a blister or that type of thing. So preventatively doing things and not worrying that maybe you lose a bit of time now because you'll lose less time later by doing it that way. Next one. Why do you think 200 miles is so popular now, and what are your best tips for them? I think it's partly just people looking for the next challenge. 100 milers have become a little more normalized. In context, there's still only tens of thousands, if that, people doing them globally. Maybe a little bit more when you include the European scene, I suppose. But let's say there's 100,000 people who run 100 miles each year. In the US, I think it's about 200,000 or close to 200,000 people that do ultras in total. And that that doesn't allow for people doing more than one in a year, so less than that realistically. So it's still a very niche thing. It's a small thing compared to, say, road marathons, half marathons, I think are the most popular distance. I believe there's a couple of million people a year do that in the US, but that's still less than 1% of the population. Anyway, the point of that is 200 milers for that select group of people who do this kind of thing are the next frontier. I think it hasn't quite given me the desire to do it yet, but I'm sure at some point I'll do one. But the idea being, if you've done a few 100-milers, what's the next thing you can do? You can either try and get faster or do something harder or longer. And particularly as people age, it is more difficult to do something faster. So a very natural next step is to maybe try and do 200 miles and see how epic that can be. And I also asked what my best tips for them are. Annie Hughes is certainly the expert on our team for that. She's actually done a really good little document about things. So for our clients who are training for that, we have a really good summary of the things that'll help. But that includes things like making sure that you get your mileage higher. Your minimum threshold of hours per week is going to be higher to get through a 200 miler than a 100 miler. Make sure you practice a lot of power hiking. Practice using the vest or the backpack, because you're going to be carrying a bit more in a 200 miler than a 100 miler. Practice sleeping as well. And this is a very difficult thing to do. And even a 100-miler, you won't necessarily get a chance to practice having a nap or seeing how that goes. But doing things like potentially night runs or seeing if you can have a 10-minute nap, 15-minute nap on the side of a trail within a long run is very valuable because you don't want that to be the first time you do it is on race day. You want it to be something you've done in advance. But there's certainly different ways that people approach that. Some people will sleep a little bit longer, some people sleep a little bit less. But kind of going back to my last point, which is it's better to be preventative. And if you can do something now that costs you a bit of time, but it keeps you moving better, then that's going to be more effective. And in a 200 mile, that's even more the case. So I would say probably sleep more than you think most other people do. Because that downtime of not moving, if it can just make you move that little bit better, recover a bit more, have your mind in it a little bit more, not be kind of zoned out and unable to focus and dizzy and that type of thing, then that's going to be really worthwhile. And if you look just at the stats for these 200 milers, you can win them by doing about a 15-minute mile pace on average. So that is a walking pace. So that's factoring in hills, that's factoring in sleep. That is very quick. I'm not saying that is easy, but just in the context of it, the people who are taking, say, twice as long as that, that's maybe a 30-minute mile on average. So you don't need to worry about, oh, I'm at mile 50 and I don't want to stop running right now because I can, and I can't afford to have a 5 minutes at this aid station to grab more food. I've got to keep pushing, pushing, pushing. That's a false economy there. You're going to pay for that later if you don't allow yourself to look after yourself. And sleep, I would argue, is one of those bigger things. And equally, once you've done one or two 200 milers, you're going to have some very specific knowledge. And some of that you can only get by doing it yourself in person. You can't just be told what's going to happen because it's going to be a bit different for each person. And you have to go through it yourself to get an idea. So the main thing you do in the build up to your first 200 miler is make sure you've got a few hundred milers under your belt. I wouldn't recommend doing a 200 miler until you have at least maybe 300 milers you've done in your life, just to get that additional experience from that. Next question, what's the best ultra performance of all time? I will give you a male and a female answer to that. So I think it's obviously very difficult to pick something, and it's difficult to compare road and trail and different distances. I think on the male side, two that jump out at me actually, there's so many more than that. I'll just mention a couple that come to mind anyway. So the 100-mile world record by Alexander Sorokin of a bit under 11 hours is frankly insane. That is absolutely amazing. He destroyed the previous world record by about 20 minutes. It's difficult to know as well with the roads how comparable that is because of things like new shoe tech, but still, that is just a mind-blowing performance. Things like new shoes, etc., are not going to have as much of an effect on the trail, if any, because it's uneven and you don't get that kind of rebound and that extra efficiency. On the trail side of things, I think almost anything Killian's done, to be honest, is amazing. Jim Walmsley at UTMB this year, where it took him, I think, 5 years to get the win. So it's not just one day, it is a performance of moving to France and several years of building up to that. Also, Jim's course record at Western States has to be right up there. For the women, this year, there was a comrades record for Gerda Stein. So she's actually the national record holder for South Africa in the marathon. She just recently ran a 2:24 in the marathon, and she now has the up and the down records at comrades. But she ran 5:44 at comrades this year for about 54 miles. So if you think about that, her split from 50 miles was also way under the world record as well, like 20 plus 30 minutes under the world record for 50 miles. But to compare it more fairly, that was only, I think, about 10 minutes only, 10 minutes off the record for comrades. So that would definitely be up there. I think potentially some of the 24-hour records, like the recent one that happened at the World Championships this year, could be up there with one of the best performances. But I think the one thing I'd say is kind of a combination of things for one performance, and that's Courtney Dauwalter being able to course record at Western States and win Hard Rock and win UTMB. I think that I'm going to call that like a summer performance, but I don't think that can be rivaled on the women's side. So I'll just see if there's any more questions that have come in, but if not, okay. Here's a couple more. What good running books have you read recently? Actually, one of them's right behind me. I read this one, We Share the Sun. It's about the Kenyan training group. So it's Kipchoge and his coach in that group. It's about how they live and the kind of things they focus on. Very interesting read to get a sense of what that's like, whether you're a trail runner or not, or road runner. It's well worth it. But yeah, in general, I'd say looking at my shelf there, I get quite a lot of running books, definitely, but I'd like to branch out beyond that as well. But that's certainly one of the ones recently that I've read that I thought was especially good. And last question here. What do you think about the value of extra long runs in training, let's say 6 hours plus? While physiologically the returns probably diminish pretty quickly, could these still be of value if structured appropriately? And importantly, if someone enjoys doing them? I think that's a very good, last thing that's very important to mention, which is you should do stuff you enjoy as well. Think about, is it going to be optimal for your training, or is there a trade-off? But by all means, do things you enjoy. If you want to be spending all of summer doing mountain adventure runs and epic circumnavigations of mountains, it may not be the perfect training for a race afterwards, but it's still going to be good training. So if that's fun and that allows you to be more consistent and to enjoy things and to do it for the long term, as well as having a sense of adventure, that alone is valuable. But then think about, is it affecting how much you can train in general because there's more recovery time? Are you getting injured doing it? Are you going into races feeling tired already and overtrained? So that would be the potential downside. Generally, I wouldn't go more than about a 5-hour training run other than build up races. And that's because physiologically, you're going to get the adaptations from just doing a long run between kind of 2 and really 3, 4, maybe 5 hours. The only reason to go longer than that is you get to practice things like nutrition, gear, the mental side of how things feel. But even then, if you do 6 hours and you're training for a race that's going to take you 30 hours, just because the food worked for 6 doesn't mean it'll definitely work for 30. But if it doesn't work for 6, it definitely won't work for 30. So you are able to test things out. You're able to practice that nutrition side of things well. But generally speaking, I'd prefer people to do back-to-back long runs. So 2 or 3 days in a row of maybe 3 to 4 hour runs. Things like the Leadville training camp, the Western States training camp, they're in this kind of format. I would say that's probably going to be more sustainable and a better stimulus overall than just doing lots of really long runs. So there is that trade-off of maybe it's fun, but is it the optimal thing? Or maybe you do it a little bit further away from your race and still manage to make sure you're getting in enough training and enough recovery to turn up your A race feeling as good as possible. But equally, it depends on what your goals are. If your goals are simply to finish things and have fun along the way, and you know that doing big, long mountain adventure runs with friends will keep you on track, much more so than doing it all on your own and some theoretical perfect way of doing it, then it's going to be better to do lots of long runs. But for someone who's trying to do the best they possibly can, just to be aware of the trade-off that if you're doing that too frequently, it's going to be harder on the body for injuries and overtraining, and that potentially back-to-back long runs can be a better way, I would say, of doing that, where you're able to recover quickly. You're still practicing all the same kind of things, and mentally you're still starting day 2 or day 3 with slightly tired or sore legs, and so that is also similar to the kind of things you'll have to psychologically deal with in a race. But definitely, if you enjoy things and it's not injuring you and you're enjoying your races, then there's nothing wrong with that at all. You want to make sure you enjoy it all and that it's fun. So thank you everyone for the questions today. I really enjoyed talking to everyone, and this will be available both on the Facebook page and the website. And as I said, there's other Q&As coming up soon, plus all the coaches have in the past done this, and they're available in those 2 places as well. But if you're looking for a coach, this is the time of year to do it. It's December, as I say this. By about mid-January, most of the coaches are going to be filled up. But at this point, if you want to get in, at least get in contact with us before Christmas, then you've got a good chance of being able to get your coach of choice. Thank you. Goodbye.